Thank you, Nader. Can you all hear me back there? Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Nader, for the invitation. I have to say it's a really an honor to get an opportunity to share some work with you all. This place and its rich and intense history and legacy is just it's humbling indeed. So thank you so much for the invitation. What I'd like to do today is share with you some work from both the collective LOK and as well as the WOJR work. I'll show about 8 projects, 4 from collective LOK and then 4 from WOJR. I just wanted to give a bit of background about the two practices just before diving into the work. The latter, clock, was started about 4 years ago, as Nader mentioned, with John Lott and Michael Kubo. And we got together to work on a competition, the Alen Institute. The reason I mention that is because the shared agenda between the three of us at the time, which really centered around the questions of the Alen Institute, questions about like the public engaging culture. As you know, Alen Institute is really all about increasing engagement in the public realm through design advocacy. So the way that we started off around that first project really became the agenda that sort of is stitched through the other projects that Clock does together. Now, the WOJR is my independent practice, and I think, although there are some overlaps between the two practices, I would say that there are some distinctions as well. A lot of our projects are motivated by several preoccupations that have to do with form and representation. We think a lot about the agency of symmetry and asymmetry. We think a lot about the deadpan and the non-emotive. We think also a lot about the possibilities of defamiliarization in architecture. In other words, trying to make the new from the known as opposed to the new from the alien. And there are also several other preoccupations that have to do with representation as well. And that's what the book is about. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. The book really tries to unpack 3 different categories of representation and talk about the agency of each of those 3. So if you'll bear with me, what I'd like to do is go through the first 7 projects, 4 o'clock, then 3 WOJR projects, relatively quickly. And then I'd love to dwell on the final WOJR project for a bit longer. This is a square that's familiar to you all. This is a project called Heart of Hearts, and it's a project that the Times Square Alliance runs every year. And for the past 8 years, actually, they've held an invited competition to commission an architect to design a Valentine heart. And the heart marks Valentine's Day, and it's become a place where hundreds of couples now come to renew their vows, become engaged, get married. Historically, the winning designs have been objects, and they have integrated the icon of the heart, which is a mandate, by the way. Objects that have some mode of interactivity, for instance, integrated lights or sound. And we saw this really as an opportunity to make a space, or to carve a distinct space within the urbanism of Times Square. As you all know better than I, the context of Times Square is unique. And so one of the challenges was to kind of out-spectacle the spectacle of Times Square. And arguably it's the most hyperbolically spectacular urban space that we know. So one of the ways that we tried to do this was to essentially augment Times Square through the use of these reflective mirrors. The ambition was to augment the spectacle and also introduce other ways of interacting with the piece as well. But I'd say first and foremost, one of the things that sort of stitches the clockwork together is this ambition to try to either evacuate space, make voids, make holes, or fill in space. So in this case, this is one of these projects where we're trying to essentially make a new void in the center of Times Square. So the multiplication of context happens in these reflections, and depending on one's proximity relative to the piece, it kind of acts like a kaleidoscope does, and at some moments producing the condition of infinite regression. The formal premise couldn't be simpler. It's based on the string of folded paper hearts, the kind of decoration that children make around Valentine's Day. And so one of the challenges was to achieve that thinness and do so in a way that allowed the reference to the paper heart to still be maintained. So one way that we did that, which is a kind of a simple way to deal with that, is to make a ring. And so the string of folded paper hearts comes together, and each folded heart relying on its neighbor to make an overall continuity of 12 hearts for stability and rigidity. And then also contributing to that structural diagram is the addition of 6 interior folded hearts, which offer a kind of stability as well. But it also offers a different scale of space. So there are arguably 3 scales of space here, one could argue. One is the object itself, the second is the space that is sort of cordoned off by the ring, and then the third is these, what we ended up calling kissing booths, areas for 2, maybe 3 people, to be alone in a way outside of the context of Times Square, and to have a moment of privacy. So here it is where you see somebody in the center, and from the center you actually cannot see oneself. And then here you see looking up through one of the kissing booths, which of course acknowledges context, but at the same time does its best to sort of frame something which is otherworldly, something which is outside of the context of Times Square. A second project with Clock is a project that we did, a competition called for the Peace Corps Commemorative Works competition. And the competition asks one to produce a commemorative work which is distinct from a memorial. So it sort of already separates itself from objects that one might find around Washington, D.C. The site is a triangle, and so one of the ideas that we had was to fill the site with a single ribbon, a ribbon that would both on the one hand sort of fill out the site, fill it with matter, and also produce a sidedness. So if you follow this ribbon, there are 2 sides. One side that addresses the hypotenuse of the triangle, and then another side which addresses the other 2 sides of the triangle. So the idea is that one might explore these spaces and come into contact with others in a way that they might not otherwise. So it's called Mappa Mundi as a way to suggest that there's a new kind of terrain that one could explore and find these different connections through the transparency of the glass. But there's another aspect to the project as well, which is about allowing one to register allowing one to understand the kind of shared aspect of the project as well. So there's this one deformation in the top of the piece, which indicates a kind of continuity in the piece that you wouldn't get otherwise. So if we fill this triangle in the PS1 proposal that we made a couple of years ago, we tried to evacuate that space. So many people here, I'm sure I know, have worked on this project before, so I won't go into detail about what it's about. But our approach to the PS1 project, which was the second time I lost it actually, the first time was 3 or 4 years earlier when WOJR got a chance to lose the competition. But this time we lost because there was already a canopy. apparently. Ball Nogs had one already with a canopy. And apparently, you're not able to do two of the same kind of project. But our proposal was to essentially get outside of the bounds of the PS1 courtyard. In other words, it was a kind of critique on the Institute. What are the ways that we might get beyond the walls of that iconic triangle? So we did that in a number of ways. One was to quite literally lift the edge of the triangle in a kind of maybe dumb extrusion, and from that extrusion hang a canopy. But that canopy could also act like a kind of periscope, if you will, and I'll explain what I mean by that. If you can imagine the canopy being clad with many small triangles, the same geometry as the triangle of the courtyard, you could imagine there being an opportunity to look up at the underbelly of the sack in order to see outside the walls of the PS1 courtyard. And there are other ways that we're trying to get outside of the courtyard as well, through a kind of doubling or a kind of mirroring. And this was done, well, the idea being that there would actually be a mirror alongside the entirety of the wall facing the most public, most prominent side of the institution. And another way we were aiming to get outside of the courtyard was to build a berm to allow one to actually get a view outside of the courtyard. The thinking, though, was that there would be no architecture in the project, if you'll allow me to say that. The thinking is that the courtyard is evacuated, and anything that needs to be thought of architecturally is a kind of amplification of something that's already there. So in the case of this perspective, we're introducing rocks that are essentially large gravel as a way to produce the necessary seating. And then, arguably, the canopy is architecture, but I would argue that it is not at a scale that is conventionally architectural. I would argue that it's really at an urban scale that it operates. And so this is the canopy in a longitudinal section, and there are moments of surprise in the piece as well, where underneath the berm, I'm reminded of Ben's proposal. We also made a grotto, maybe not as elegant as Ben's, but we made a grotto indeed, and linked that to one of the windows that would allow one to look outside of the wall. There's one last way that we were trying to get people outside of the PS1 courtyard, and that is through a kind of erosion of these mirror tiles toward the center of the sack. And at that point, where it comes most close to the participant, there's a kind of, you can imagine it almost producing a kind of dog collar-like condition where you can look up and hopefully all of the context is sort of blinded by the rest of the mirrored tiles. And so, as you'll see in the next project, a lot of drawings that we do as a way to imagine narratives that take place in these projects is through what we often refer to as scenario diagrams. So playing out a multitude of scenarios as a way to help us understand whether or not the project is actually doing what it claims to be doing. And so in this case, obviously, by evacuating the space, we're kind of maximizing the potential of different scenarios to occur. And one of the requirements, as I'm sure many of you know, is to also have things like water and other sort of fun elements like that. So rather than putting them in the space proper, sort of pushed them to the outside toward the colonnade and used them as the way to kind of reaffirm that edge. And then, of course, you have to have your party scene as a way to try to lure the jury. So we imagined this becoming similar to a kind of very large urban disco ball in the evenings. The last project I'll show just before I shift over to the clockwork is this project, the project that we did first together for the Alen Institute. And it's similar to the previous project in the way that it aims to kind of evacuate the space and make it as sort of span the most generic space with just enough specificity by way of the figure of the plan. So for those of you who know the new ground floor, or know the project rather, the aim was to kind of take everything above that was on, I think, floor 6, maybe, floor 6 or 7, and everything that was below the sort of makeshift gallery that they had before, and sort of conflate those programs and have those happen in the new ground floor plan. So a lot has to happen in that space. There's a gallery space, there's exhibition space, there's office space, there is also a small library space. So the idea was to really kind of pack as much of that fixed program into what we made a kind of bow tie figure, so that there was one bottleneck between the very public and the back of house, but at the same time the idea being that there would be some ability to see from the street all the way to the back of the space. So as you can imagine, to do that, a lot of the work really happens in the ceiling, and so there was the idea that we would sort of embed all the infrastructure into the ceiling and hide that behind this sort of gauzy white coffer system that we developed. But as I mentioned before, the scenario diagrams were really helpful insofar as they kind of explained how the generic space, the open space, could accommodate the widest variety of possible programs, something that was really important to David at the Alen Institute. There was one other aspect to the project that that hasn't happened yet, regrettably, and that is this idea that they had about the street seat. So in the brief, there was this notion that there would be a physical extension, a potential physical extension of the project down onto the street. So we imagined it being a way to literally pull the figure of the bow tie out into the street and produce yet another frame that would kind of indicate or kind of pull out the program that is happening inside. So hopefully that happens in the near future. These are some initial photos, and sort of pains me to show these photos because of the way that the curtain meets the ground. It's since been corrected, but if you can see, like, it's as though someone's pants are just a little bit too long, and that's happening all along the edge. And so I don't have better photos than this yet, regrettably, but just if you can kind of crop that out or get that out of your mind. Or maybe you like to wear your pants long, so this is actually like exciting for you. So to shift away from the more public-oriented sort of cultural and institutional work, I wanted to shift gears and chat a bit about the WOJR projects. So we recently published a monograph, and it's called Room for Artifacts. And we tried to use the monograph really as a way to look at the projects with fresh eyes, if possible, sort of unbiased eyes, as an archaeologist might look at a found object. And so we tried to use it as a way to identify new consistencies in the work that we may not have understood previously. So in the book we show 16 projects 3 times through 3 different modes of representation, one being conceptual drawings, really distilled graphic drawings, a second being orthographic drawings, plans, sections, really drawings of edges, and then finally we show the projects again as visualizations or as kind of photographs of the project. And so implicit in the book, implicit in the argument in the book, is that each of these types of representation kind of helps us understand projects in radically different but overlapping ways. One of the projects in the book is a project called the Berryhill House, which will be on Block Island. These are visualizations, by the way. And it's sort of a really charged site in the sense that it is an archaeological gold mine of features from the Narragansett people who used to live on Block Island. And so the site is really covered with archaeological features that we are doing our best to avoid. And which is one of the reasons the house is sort of pulled up off of the ground and will be held up with a distribution of piles. But the site is unique on Block Island in that it is large. Typically, most of the sites on Block Island are a quarter of an acre or less. This site happens to be, I think it's 11 acres. And what's kind of interesting about that is that despite the large size of the site, given all the setbacks from the wetlands, from the ocean, and several others, too many to name, really our site is, if you imagine a bounding box around the house, that's really the site. So there's a lot of constraints on where the house goes, despite there being a large site. So the project really tries to get some traction from the vernacular on the island. And this is maybe where some of our interest in the defamiliarization of existing projects comes through. A lot of the houses on Block Island, if you haven't been, are just beautiful, extremely simple cedar-clad gable roof houses. And so we were interested in trying to use that as a kind of default, but then to augment certain characteristics in certain ways. So the first way that we're thinking about augmenting, thank you, is through a kind of sort of relentless extrusion of the house. Really there are two main experiences that the house offers. One is on the lower level, which is a kind of, relatively speaking, a sort of expansive, horizontally connective experience to the landscape. And that's also helped by way of the porch that wraps all the way around. And then by comparison, the upper level being something much more introverted and much more utilitarian, actually, in terms of the way that the bedrooms are laid out. Because of the length of the house, there is an idea that there's a possibility of opening up all of the doors between each of the bedrooms to produce this sort of telescopic view down the length of the house, allowing one to understand that the organization is an enfilade. So this is one of these conceptual drawings that helps us sort of distill what is important to the project. So in this case, really understanding the figurality of that upper level and the continuity between each of these sort of static moments along the length of the project. This project actually didn't get past the board because of its length, the planning board. So there's a new version of this project, which I'll show next time I come, which is 2 squares. So it's about twinning, and it's essentially taking the project and splitting it into 2. So regrettably, this version won't be built, but the next version takes many cues from this, but tries to deal with the issue of splitting it apart into 2. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of interest in the relationship between symmetry and asymmetry, and how one can sort of use the relationship between asymmetry and symmetry as a way to convey ordering principles inherent in the project. Shifting gears to a project that we made for a company called Aesop. I think a few of you, I know Nader has made 1 or 2 of these projects before, and maybe others. It's a project that we made several years ago now, back in 2012, for Aesop, and one of the prompts is that they ask you to consider some of the more traditional architectural elements in the city in which the project will be built. And so one of the, we use this as really an opportunity to look at crown molding and wrought iron in potentially new ways. If not new ways, then maybe ways that defamiliarize those architectural elements. In this case, we've invented, I think, 7 crown moldings and combined them in various ways as a way to produce both a surface and simultaneously a kind of a shelving system, which is really the requirement by ASOP. And the hope is that there might be an understanding of this which is sort of ambiguous between whether it is a kind of utilitarian shelving system or a kind of decorative surface. And so we're trying to strike a balance between those two archetypes. The project is embedded in the ground, so you come off the street and you come down 2 half flights of stairs. And I mention this because there's another way that we're thinking about the defamiliarization of crown molding, and that is in the rail of the stair. So as you descend the stair, there is one profile that then transforms as one descends into the space. So it's hard to see in these images, but I'll zoom in. But one of the reasons I show this project is because it begins to show an attitude that we have about modes of fabrication, I think. So if there are 2 different ways that we're manipulating crown moldings in this case, they each use a method of fabrication that couldn't be more distinct, right? So in this case, this is a foam test of the rotation of the crown molding, which relies on CNC milling in a pretty serious way. Whereas the extrusions, couldn't be simpler to make. So, sort of interested in the potential that a project might warrant different types of fabrication, digital or more historical methods, and that the project wouldn't sort of push one agenda over the other. And then here are our catalog of crown moldings. And there are many crown moldings to choose from, but as any good architect, we decided that catalog wasn't right, and we had to invent our own. So these are the ones that we invented, which led to another project about ornamentation, which is a project called Totems. I'm going to skip ahead. Now, Totems is a project that also deals with ornamentation, questions of ornamentation. This is also a project from about 5 years ago, but one of the added layers of intrigue for us was an idea about high fidelity and low fidelity. So these are objects that we made that aimed to include both a kind of highly articulated and formally expressive profile, the one on the left, and also a profile that was relatively dormant. And so as one moves about the totem, there's a sort of oscillation between the expressive profile and the dormant profile. And this is something, the kind of the conceal and reveal of information is something that I think is sort of embedded in other aspects of the work, especially our interest in the kind of the role of elevation in conceiving of architecture, which will come back in the last project that I talk about. So this was a project for us that really made us maybe productively uncomfortable in the sense that we hadn't really taken on questions of ornamentation with such gusto, for lack of a better term. And so we made, I don't know, maybe 70 or 100 of these maquettes as a way to start to have a discourse in the office about beauty, actually. And it's a tricky thing to talk about in an academic context, maybe. But this led to a number of debates in the office about the role of ornamentation and the role of beauty in architecture. and how one might start to develop a bias about the role of ornamentation. And so, we use this also as an opportunity to develop a set of drawings that looked at two different methods of representation simultaneously, the kind of straightforward, very explicit graphic of the totem, as well as a way of describing it that's much more about the surface and about the three-dimensionality and about the contouring. And so these were made, I don't usually show a lot of process, but these were made with a robotic arm. And just to give you a sense that these are made simply with extruded profiles, and the same extruded profile that happens 4 times as you rotate it 90 degrees. And they're symmetrical about the center axis, which is at eye height. Now the last project that I'd like to chat about, maybe with a little bit, I think, we have plenty of time, is the Mask House, which is a house that we've been working on for quite some time. It's not built yet, but the hope is that it will be built this fall or next year. This requires a little bit of backstory. So it's a tragic story, actually. This is a project for a filmmaker who purchased some land in next to Cornell University on Cayuga Lake in Ithaca. And his younger brother was a Cornell student and an environmentalist, and had spent a lot of time in Cayuga Lake, going out on the canoe quite regularly. One day, though, that he went out early morning, and he was never found. So this project quickly became an extremely charged project and started to ask us questions that we weren't sure if architecture could really have answers to. Questions like, how does a project help someone grieve, or how does a project provide a space for someone to kind of memorialize and remember his brother who had perished in the lake. So the site looks at the lake. Actually, it's on the edge of a cliff that overlooks the lake, and really what we've tried to make is a kind of separation for the client, a separation between the kind of real world, the world of the everyday, and other world. And so this has sort of led to a lot of thinking about masking, about separating, about coming into contact with a mask and sort of participating in a transformation from one world to another world. This is an image of the site, and the site itself is somewhere right here. And the younger brother perished just up the ways of the lake some way. We're imagining that the project will have 2 forms of approach. One which is the sort of more formal, if I can use that word, approach to the house, where there's a perpendicular relationship between the one who's approaching and the mask. And there's another approach which comes from the other side of the site, which is a set of ramps that lead one up through the trees into this slot of space that separates the mask from the house proper. And the thinking behind that is that there might be an opportunity for family and friends who might not enter the house to experience the connection to the lake without having the same formal experience of having experiencing the threshold between the real world and the other world. But for those who do approach in the kind of more formal way, there's a kind of separation between the mask and the house, which is imagined to kind of reorient one. So as you approach, then you go behind this gasket, and then there's a new line of symmetry that, as you walk in, reveals that there is a box of space, or a frame rather, probably a better way to talk about it, that is now in line with your entry. So this slot of space is really imagined to provide a pause, a kind of reorientation. If at first one approaches with a kind of horizontally expansive view, when you enter into this slot of space, there's a kind of disorientation or an orientation vertically that sort of separates your previous horizontal expansive view from the next one. So this is the slot of space that we've visualized. And you start to get a sense for how the ramp kind of comes behind this slot of space and allows one to go up into the deck space to have a view out to the lake. So the way that we were thinking about the plan was that we wanted to kind of produce a single space that would act like a kind of frame that one could inhabit. And then all the other programs that were asked for, things like the bedroom, the kitchen, and the bathroom, would be really conceptualized more as sort of niches or sort of frames that were hinging off of the main space, so as to not impede that primary space. So this is the view as we imagine it as one enters, where the chimney blocks the mullion in the back for that moment. And this is a view of the rooftop where you start to get a sense for how these other elements interface with the roof deck. And we imagine it looking something like this. And I should say something about the way that we think about these visualizations. I would say that we try to use them as a way to convey a narrative about the project that might not be as evident in the orthographic drawings. So we talk about these in terms of how they're really kind of cinematic and how they aim to convey a kind of, in this case, a kind of mournfulness. And you know, it could be argued that this way of representing might do that in a more charged way, perhaps, than the orthographic drawings. And I guess I would call these aspirational in the sense that when this is built, I suspect that there will be differences. But for us, they're important as a way to both have conversations with our client, but I mean, really more importantly for us, it's to have conversations with audience like you all about how this kind of representation might produce mood or affect in a way that orthographic drawings might not.
So this is not built?
Not yet.
It's a record?
It is. This is the back side of the house. And what you see here that you might not see elsewhere is the underbelly. Underbelly of the project also has a mirror, which acts like a kind of frame in and of itself. And so one who's walking underneath the house might have occasion to look up and see the context changed in some way. But this is a drawing that tries to get at how we're imagining the hierarchy of the plan, where the light gray represent these niches that are separate, in a way, thinking about it as a kind of tree branching plan, where all spaces hinge from this primary space, but that none of the spaces can compete in terms of like the purity of that framed space. And then here are the seven. I think there are 7 frames, each of which try to give visual access to the context in different ways, through a kind of a vertical window, a horizontal window, a large picture window, a view to the sky through this tube, and then there's one other very, very small window, which is at the scale of the body, which allows one to lie in bed and actually be oriented toward the location of the brother's death. So just want to spend a few minutes just before I wrap up to talk about how this project has started to get us thinking about about masks and potentially the role of artifacts in architecture. This has started to get us thinking about we've used this as an opportunity to investigate masks from a kind of from a more conceptual lens. So we've developed a set of artifacts. One artifact being this, which is a bas-relief model of in stone of bark tracings that we made. And the reason we've done that is because one of the aspects of the project that I didn't talk much about is that the mask does a job in camouflaging the box behind. And so we've spent some time looking at bark patterns and trying to reproduce them in the possibility that the wood that we use to make the mask might either be milled in that way to produce more camouflage, more disguise for the house behind, or it might be charred wood that also starts to produce a similar kind of pattern. But we've used the mask house as a way to push a different conceptual project about masks. And so there's a show that we're going to put on in a couple of days in Zurich that's called Other Masks. And for that show, we are showing a large model of the mask house, some drawings, but also 7 new masks that deal with the sort of characteristics of form that we're interested in for the mask proper. So things like symmetry and asymmetry, games of flatness and elevation that where depth gets revealed as you move about it. And so we've made 7 of these masks. Also, all these masks try to take advantage of what's unique about a treehouse, which is that the potential of the top and the bottom of the house to be identical, which is what each of these masks also does. So this one is a circle in elevation that then has these sort of corrugated wood. This is an image of an edge. This mask might be most like the totems. It's somewhere between a totem and a mask, where as you move about it, there's a kind of conflation of profiles to produce a kind of dormant profile of the rectangle. This is milled in Waltz quartzite. Maybe the most postmodern of the bunch being this grid mask, which is also Waltz quartzite, which is the one I probably feel most uneasy about, given the sort of freedom with which we've selected these different shapes. Most of the other masks are more, maybe you could say, rigorous with respect to using repetition in the mask to produce difference rather than selecting sort of ad hoc, which is maybe a more of a kind of postmodern sentiment, maybe. And that grid mask has entasis. And we've also spent some time to develop these brass armatures that engage the masks in different ways. There is an interest in anthropomorphic qualities as well, so evidence of that might come about when you see the nose in this mask, or the armature popping out and producing a nose. This is the brush mask. And then the last mask, and then I'll end here, is this wood mask, where this is called the stripe mask. The grain of the wood is going at a kind of 45 degree in opposition to the grain of the mask, and so it ends up producing these bizarre forms on the edges, and that's the last slide that I have for today. So I will end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Are you open to some questions?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Maybe I can lead off the questions. I'm not interested in this question from a technical perspective, but insofar as it can form an attitude about your work. Why does is it the Block Island house? Is it, why do you provide a gutter for a roof strategy that is precisely about the overhang, and in such a symmetrical fashion.
Yeah.
So that I would assume that for you the figuration of that end is a very important one, and maybe you can describe that a little bit.
Yeah.
Unrelated to that, or related to that, could you elaborate on what is more than less postmodern, and what does postmodernism
Yeah.
mean?
Maybe I can start with that one and go to the first one.
Okay.
I mean, the second part of the unrelated part of the question, the postmodern question, is something we've been thinking a lot about. And the grid mask that I showed is a mask that I show kind of reluctantly. So, but I can tell you why we've made it. In the office, there's a sort of spectrum of attitude toward form making. On the one side is that there should be no choice that one can make arbitrarily in a project. On the other side of that spectrum is an idea that there might be kind of whimsy or sort of humor that might be possible when sort of selecting things that don't really seem to have an apparent order or convey an order. And so the grid mask with the triangle, the circle, the diamond, I would say represents this side of the spectrum. The side of the spectrum which is about whimsy and sort of chance in the selection of Platonic forms. And so I think I have that mask as part of the series precisely because it opens up that question as to where we kind of lie on that spectrum. I think another project that is not unlike the grid mask is the short elevation of the Block Island house, right? Whereas there's a choice to have the circular window, which I can get comfortable with if it relates to the enfilade, right? So you have the sort of telescopic aperture that is on center with the head that kind of is the exact same dimension as the width of the door. And so I'm more comfortable with that circle than I am with the circle and the U and the triangle and the diamond in the grid mask. And the reason this is so pertinent is because now that we're shifting to 2 houses for that project, the 2 square houses, as of now, that circle has remained. And there's no enfilade. There's no, in my view, no cause for that circle to remain. And so it's been a discussion in the office as to whether that is a kind of whimsical, postmodern sort of like free selection, or whether it should be reconceived so that opening has more relevance to the rest of the project. In terms of the gutter, it's not you're not going to like the answer. It's really because we want to enable as much sort of interaction between the edge of the house and the landscape as possible. So along that side, we don't want a wall of rain to kind of produce a boundary between the inside of the house and the outside of the house. So all the waters are limited to these 2 points, which doesn't provide a kind of boundary between the inside and the outside.
I want to go back to your definitions of postmodernism, if you could expand them a little bit, because it seems that you encapsulate your strategies to techniques of wit and humor, something that this school has been discussing with Dan Wood. And for some of us old folks, the era of postmodernism had many other capacities. And this may not be evident in the present instantiation, but maybe I can test it on you. Looking back, that was an era where the profile of history as a broader project
Mhm.
was expanded. So
Mhm.
its morphologies, its typologies, its iconographies expanded the modern project.
Uh-huh.
And modernism was defined not merely in terms of the 20th century, but as part of a larger Enlightenment project,
Yeah.
and going back. And part of that had to do with the textuality within which a lot of those projects became embedded in as a kind of referential process. And this, of course, had many
Yeah.
other instantiations in
Yeah.
other forms. I'm thinking of, Philip Glass and other media that partook in some of those operations. Do you share some of these other concerns that parallel wit, or have you channeled your interest through humor and wit?
I mean, I'm not funny.
This is funny.
I mean, I hope it's clear that that when I'm using the term wit, I'm not that comfortable with it. I mean, it might be implicit that someone in the office won that debate that day, and got his witty circle and diamond and triangle in the mask. And I don't mean to shift the focus of the question elsewhere, but just for a moment, one of the things that does is it produces a kind of space for discourse in the office. So just yesterday, I was explaining to this individual that, I would present this grid mask, and if prompted about it, I would talk about it in these terms. That defining the culture of the office requires that you're consistently stretching your comfort zone, and so I think for me, that having that included as part of the mask series is important, so that we're always keeping ourselves in check with respect to what our arguments are with respect to form. So I don't find a lot of humor in the WOJR work. I think the clock work might be different because that's three individuals who have three different attitudes about architecture coming together around these projects, and some of those projects deal with humor in a way that the WOJR projects do not. But I would call the WOJR work much more about the deadpan, much more about the non-emotive, much more about the kind of the mournful, and so we haven't had occasion yet to have a project that is really about happiness and wit, and I don't think I'm going to seek those kinds of projects out.
So what is a deadpan?
The deadpan? The deadpan is a kind of a way that we think about the work that is not, let's say, not revealing of itself. There's a kind of a front beyond which there are other layers that might be revealed as one looks more. So the Mask House, for instance, I think because of its sort of lack of information in that elevation, there's a sort of a deadpan quality to that. Similarly, a lot of the projects look at flatness, right? At least the way that we try to represent them is often through a flat elevation, or the visualizations are often about capturing the ordering principles embedded in the project through its elevation. And so I don't know, the deadpan is also for me a kind of reaction, and maybe this is related to my time in graduate school, where there still was a kind of fascination with the digital project and expressiveness, and so maybe we're on the other side of the spectrum insofar as we're trying to make work that doesn't reveal itself so explicitly through expression.
Don't you think there is something that I'm not sure if it's humor, but in your work, the best parts to me is the moments of unexpected decisions that you make, which does not immediately belong to the generations of architects, perhaps. And those are the best moments. And sometimes they're very ordinary decisions, like the railing on the roof of the mask house, or the tapering of the railing at the bottom, and its expressive thinness. And I think you've managed to maintain that in some of your projects, and those are the best moments of your work. I thought the crown molding, stacking it, was the better part of the project, and I thought I was a bit surprised on a good way when you told me that you created your own, which I realized then you've changed the figure of the standard off-the-shelf molding to something. I always read that project as a stacking of series of moldings, and you've just managed to find continuity across. So I think that aspect of your work, just for an outside audience, is very exciting. I'm not sure you have to formulate it within the history of architecture, but that's a part of your work that is very engaging and surprising. So that's why.
Robert?
Yeah. I was when you were showing the house for the brother in mourning, I was struck by, there were two different interior renders that you showed of it. One of them was very iconic, kind of monumental in a way, the on-axis one. And then there was the other one that was crosswise. I don't think it was particularly oblique, but it seemed more casual. And in the latter of the two, the house simply looked like it was unfurnished, like not yet moved into, like any empty house might be. Whereas the one that was on axis looked like it was a kind of, quasi-religious image, a hyper-iconic image. And I was just thinking about, you started the discussion of that house with a question of how you could create a house on behalf of someone who is in a state of mourning. And I was just thinking about the question of the purposes of houses. And I'm going to elaborate on that just by also bringing back the discussion of postmodernism, because postmodernism, I mean, there were many, many different aspects of it for architecture. There were those that Nader brought up, but then there was also a kind of high-low transformation that some of the, Venturi's critique of late modernism was that it had become it was something that was like hyper abstract, austere, didn't lend itself to the, I suppose, messy circumstances of actual life. And he uses some examples in Complexity and Contradiction, the stacked house, the Johnson one. Anyway, I bring these things up because there's something about your sensibility, which is, and it's very beautiful. I think that your work is gorgeous, and at the same time, it reminds me of those kinds of commitments that architects have that sometimes will invest the most ordinary circumstances with a very heightened, quasi-spiritual, nearly religious iconographic quality, which to my mind in some ways, I guess this is, some hesitation on that point, in thinking about the work, is that it's at odds with the accommodation of just common, ordinary life. Yeah. And I just, why must it always be? First, do you see it as always elevating the status of ordinary life, like that image, at all? Is that do you think I'm misreading it, and if not, maybe you have some thoughts about this question of what you invest into, say the word daily rituals.
Yeah. Well, I was an altar boy.
Now, wait a second, this is not fair because you said you weren't funny.
So that might have some.
Being funny.
That might have some impact.
That's it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like the question of formality and the sublime. I haven't thought about it as spiritual, but I think comes about because of the sort of precision with which we're trying to frame moments in a project. So in a case like this, like for us, the project is best conveyed through an image which conceals the mullion behind this fireplace, right? The moment you start to, you move about, that sort of fiction of purity is immediately broken.
Right.
And so that's why I call these renderings aspirational, in the sense that I know that there is a kind of ordinary aspect to each of these projects. There's a kind of there's work done that sort of, it's not so much about elevating the status of the spaces, but it's about conveying the idea of the project. So when I said, this is really for this kind of audience, what I meant by that is, like, how can you make a selection of visualizations and a set of decisions about visualizations that convey ideas about architecture to our discipline, right? And so I think the more kind of casual photographs don't do that in the same way. They lack that clarity of intent and the ordering principles that are embedded in the projects. But I can see how one would imagine them to be a kind of elevating of the status of the project. I hope that's not the takeaway, though.
But the question maybe related to that is, then I was looking at this image now, and going back to others that you presented of this house, there is a certain classicism in the composition. And that, for me, goes back to, I'm older than Adair, so certain things about modernism, postmodernism, are even more ingrained in me. And in my mind, I keep repeating the fact that using the grid that is the default diagram for objectivity, in which, you don't, as a grid, is a certain module for whatever reason. And the Platonic solid, they have their own rules. You don't play with them. You get a sphere as a sphere, as a center, as a surface that works in a certain way. The cube, the same thing. And so for me, the arbitrariness and the association with postmodern that you have in relation to that grid, and it's not a judgment, a value judgment about that. It doesn't work. I mean, I don't understand it, let's put it this way. On the other end, in this representation and with the moldings and so on, there is a certain, for lack of a better word, classicism. And I think it is in there that the normality of the life gets elevated. And I wonder if you can say, you said about your interest for symmetry and asymmetry, and I was wondering if there is something about this return to a certain structure of the composition of the image that is very pictorial and in a sense has an history. And I'm reminded of some rendering that is equal realistic than yours, confusingly realistic, that are the one that already does, in which he also studied very much the issue of where is the vanishing point, where is the axis. They're completely different because deal with the organization of the mess. And there too there is a sublimation of the quotidian in a way, in a different direction, diametrically opposed to.
I think one of the reasons that I might be interested in these more classical formal mechanisms, I think could be reactionary against the digital project. Like, there was a moment maybe about 4 years ago where I kind of made a list of what I was calling anachronistic methods of form making. Things that had been recently considered passé or taboo, things like symmetry, a golden section, these things that have been kind of like passed over for new ways of thinking about form making that rely on a parametric understanding of space. And so I think each of these projects are kind of an experiment in these maybe anachronistic modes of form making. I was able to be in Rome for a few years ago, and I spent my time there kind of making a series of kind of proto-architectural objects that looked at these formal mechanisms. So things like labyrinths, maquettes, things that were allowing me to kind of experiment with symmetry and asymmetry in ways that were not maybe contemporary. And so from those tests, they've started to kind of fold into the projects in real ways. And maybe this relates to Nader's earlier comment during the introduction, this sort of this desire to be maybe precise to a fault, like this kind of reductivist distillation of form or of like, let's say in this case threshold. Like, what is the minimal means by which those goals can come about?
Can I ask you, for those people who do not know your work, broadly speaking, they may not recognize that you've had to suppress a whole portfolio of work in order to render the message that you have today. If I were to draw in some of the other digital work, which is as digital, no more or no less than what you've presented today, as part of this lecture, do you see the thinking of that, its symmetries, its operations, its compositions, in confluence with this message? Or do you see that as, do you see this work as a repudiation of your earlier work?
No, I think it's been a kind of transition. I think the work that I think you're referencing, I still think has these.
I'm thinking of some of the single surface buildings. I'm thinking of some of the.
But grad school doesn't count, right?
It does for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think between, once I finished my thesis,
there were some competitions afterwards too.
Yes, right, that's true.
Look, I don't mind.
Yeah.
But you have to be clear, because the one way to answer this is to say that I reject my own history. I take a more moral position about it. The other one is to recognize that it's not a stylistic question to begin with. It's operational, and therefore it may have many different ways of being materialized, and therefore completely linear and in confluence with what you're doing.
Can I interrupt for a sec? Don't you think it is always a stylistic question, and the operational questions are only in service to stylistic commitments that are always external to and prior to any operation?
I didn't want to reveal that in my question. I want him to reveal that.
You're pretending that it's possible, what you said.
I want him to be able to, he's got the platform, so he gets to define it whichever way he wants.
All right, sorry.
What Robert said. But the question is it really about a kind of transition, or was there a moment where there was a realization that the work I was making was somehow at odds with the work I was about to make? I'm trying to understand the question more, not Eric.
In the same way, culture likes to produce oppositional thinking.
Yeah.
The digital versus the analog.
Yeah.
The classical versus the modern.
Yeah.
Many people overlook the ways in which Aalto was educated in order to do the work that he did later. The ways in which Aspen was educated in order to do the work that he did later.
Yeah.
Or the ways in which Plečnik operated as a very modern architect, despite the iconographies that were underlying it. I'm interested in that generation of work, and if I were to place you in that cultural moment, except 100 years later, how do you see yourself? Did those architects in your mind see themselves as repudiating their early work, or they saw it as a kind of indispensable moment of formation that is in complete confluence with it? It's a broader question.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think it's the latter. I think if I presented this work differently and showed work from, say, 10 years ago, I think I would talk about it in similar terms, actually, with similar themes and concerns that just have different outputs, actually. The way that things are made might be slightly different. The representational techniques might also be different. But I think that there's a strand that actually links even some of the more digitally oriented work to this. Like thinking about this issue of the difference between new from the known versus new from alien. Defamiliarization, essentially, as opposed to this sort of, alien form. I think the work has always been about...
But when it comes to your work now, when you do a railing or a totem, you're morphologically and spatially much more adaptive to alien form, but when it comes to a house, you extrude. And that's something that you may not have done 10 years ago.
Yeah. But you see the totems as alien form?
No, I don't. I see them as a very, those are the most interesting ones because they are completely familiar and alien at the same time. Right. But the techniques that you adopt are, they slalom back and forth between figurative ambitions, but configurative setups that actually set you up for certain repetitions and patterns that are innate to the medium that you're working in.
Yeah. That's right.
Liam, it's a little frustrating to hear constant opposition, that it's it's either it's kind of either postmodern or it's operational, or you were digital and now you're kind of. And I know that I find your work honestly just really inspiring, and kind of a real you're such a strong voice for I think a discipline that's kind of in crisis, basically, that is looking for ways of resolving the incredible progress that's happened in the past, say, 15 years that you've been an architect, but at the same time the incredible crisis that basically the world has kind of gone through. And I think when I look at this, the way that I resolve this kind of transition that you're talking about and where you're moving, to me it's not about being either historical or modern or contemporary or any of these dialectical things, and rather I think it's just more complex about history. That's what I see. I see for instance, even in this image, we know that the mask is this kind of milled bark. But the kind of openings, the alignments allude to other ordering systems. And I feel like the way that you would resolve it is kind of the way the discipline is resolving itself now, which is everything is up for grabs. There's a kind of flatness. And you're kind of representing that moment that we're at right now, where, it's all available to us. It feels like history is quite flat. And in that way, history is quite generative right now. And it's forming these really radical projects. And I find your work really radical in that sense. Not because of any oppositional mode, but because of really how it deals with history.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I think I touched on it a little bit in the ASOP project, where, and maybe this way I said it in a kind of overly simplistic way, but the idea that you might have two totally different techniques at play is sort of emblematic, I think, sort of on a small scale. It's suggestive of a larger attitude that I find really compelling, which is that, for a project, you might rely on not only these different techniques, but also the kind of lineages that each of those techniques suggest, and also the kinds of value sets and, the value sets that are kind of entrenched in each of those techniques, right?
Can we talk a little bit more about the mask and what's the potential of the mask in architecture? Because I see this image and it's really intriguing and it's very inspiring. But then there are things that I don't understand, or maybe I don't know what's the difference for you between a mask and a screen, because I think that a screen we all know what it is. A mask suddenly brings a whole new world of possibilities. But a mask is something that negates some features, but accepts and adapts to others. And for example, in this house, you are negating even the access or the entrance. So almost there's nothing left, or there's nothing that connects, maybe the structural connections between the house and the mask. So it's kind of something that stays behind and completely negates what's after. So I would like you to talk about that a little bit more, also seeing that your work evolves, thinking more about that term.
I like the question a lot because the difference between a screen and a mask, as you suggest, is quite significant. I think the mask is all about, in my mind, disguise, and I like the connotations of the word mask for reasons that have to do with like identity, like the idea that a mask is transforming or even substituting an identity for what's behind. Whereas a screen, I think, could be argued is more of a, it's not less about transformation, it's more about a kind of softening or a kind of like approximation of or a low fidelity version of. Like the mask has the potential of lying, of actually like subverting what is behind, and it makes that thickness like its own architecture project, which is why we've sort of taken the liberty to make 7 new masks that deal with those issues of symmetry, elevational games, thickness, and depth, and like, we also talk a lot about anthropomorphism and like whether these, and maybe that gets us back to the discussion about postmodernism, but that some of these things are creatures, and especially this project, which is in the woods, and the idea that one might come upon it, like what sort of like lifelike features might it offer, and so the mask, I think, starts to conjure some of those issues of like anthropomorphism, identity, like creatureness, things that I think a screen being more archetypal than mask. Like mask is somehow ambiguous between something that one wears for ritual and tradition and so forth, and a screen by comparison is sort of more, in my mind, utilitarian and architectural in that respect. And so the idea that like ritual and tradition could be looked at in mask as opposed to in screen is of interest to me, and relates actually a lot to the book Room for Artifacts, because the argument being that like an artifact is kind of a palimpsest of all of these different influences, from cultural to kind of utilitarian to historical. And so I think the mask is really different than the screen in that respect, and is like much more charged in my mind than the more architectural utilitarian screen.
But I think related to that question, the mask, even if you don't wear it, it has an identity, right? You can have a mask hanging on a wall, and it is something by itself.
Yeah.
And it seems also that there's a certain interest about the treatment of the surface of the mask to acquire that identity. I think even the exhibition that you're going to have in Zurich in a few days, there's this kind of obsession with the treatment of the surface to make the mask acquire a certain quality and identity, which is also related to the mask house, as you were showing these ideas of how the screen could, the mask could potentially acquire a certain texture in the form of a camera flash. So I think maybe if you can speak a little bit about that idea of the surface in relationship to the mask, and the ornamentation, or the question of the ornament in regards to that.
Yeah, I think the question of the relationship between surface and form in these, there's a spectrum of attitudes, I think. This one is probably on one end of the spectrum, and that is like we designed this in such a way that there would be a kind of relationship between the orientation of the marbling of the wood and the orientation of the stripes of the geometry. This was something that was designed, whereas some of the other ones where we're, say, milling the more totemic one out of Valt's quartzite, there's a hope that there will be a kind of figurality about the marbling that is in dialogue with the object, but that's up for chance. And so I think, in some cases there's a sort of like ideal way that they play out, but we're not sure because we're relying on nature to produce these other surfacial conditions. And in a case like this, although there still are kind of natural behaviors in the wood that are surprising, like we lined them all up on a 45 in order to produce this sort of like game of 45 on 45. So all that to say, Leon, that like some of these are sort of more controlled in that respect, and other of them are admittedly kind of experimental in that respect.
Can I just say, the regard that these pieces seem to be, just for me, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, the regard that these pieces are operating, which you show as a kind of continuation of the mask house, seems to be very different from the one that the house itself is operating on. And I'm having a bit of a problem understanding the relationship between the two, because therein lies the biggest contradiction for me, which is to say that in the mask house, you have this kind of processional entryway that kind of obfuscates this moment of truth, what is happening behind the wall, that is to say. But at the same time, you realize that the wall itself, which is not really a wall, is engendering a reality that is different than what is behind it and what is in front of it.
So you're missing the second layer. You want another layer behind this.
No, the third layer is engendered, whether you like it or not. I mean, it's something that happens.
Which is the third layer?
Historically. That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, maybe you know that, but the idea of the mask here seems to be getting kind of lost, because really the difference that you sense while looking at it from different directions doesn't happen through a historical context, but rather through an optical context. And for me, if I were to, ask you if you could contextualize your work, it wouldn't be, in a historical perspective, just like, most of these questions have been kind of focused on, but rather within your own work. And if you can really talk about the difference between that project and the much more sophisticated, project which precedes that, the house.
Well, I think you're right to say that these aren't. I wouldn't contextualize these historically first. I think you're right to say that it's about optics. It's about a kind of anamorphic game, right? Like for us, the kind of reveal that this depth occurs is that sort of unexpectedness is a game that we're really invested in. And so like the game of flatness and depth is something that is sort of that happens throughout all of these masks. And I also say happens in the mask house mask, actually. So I wouldn't talk about that really historically. You were making a distinction between that having a kind of historical context and these having a kind of geometric or optics context. I see them as similar. In terms of like how they might be different, like I can imagine one needing that second layer in order so that there's a gap, so that there's a kind of gasket between this and something else. Well, we didn't do that. We made these masks that were really about just focusing on that first layer. And for us, like issues of symmetry, top and bottom being identical, the game of anamorphic projection, the importance of elevation, and the reveal as you move about it, those, in my mind, make these masks consistent.
I'm wondering about your hyper-realistic visualization.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what it is that you would find out, what it is that you think you find out in the built reality of the project.
Yeah.
And also whether you ever worry that there won't be enough surprise in the build.
When you say surprise, you mean surprise in, oh, it's built, this is different than the rendering?
Yeah.
And that will happen, right? I mean, because we've designed these to the extent that they can be materialized in a virtual environment. So that means we've detailed all of these projects. But I think when the new CD set gets made before construction, we will have learned something from these visualizations that will hopefully allow us to make improvements, actually. In terms of like the surprise of not seeing it in this kind of mournful, just to use the Mask House as an example, not seeing in this kind of like mournful environment, that's likely. I mean, the likelihood of one happening upon the house, you know, on the day that it happens to be, you know, an environment like the one that you see is very, very slim. So I think I'm comfortable with the idea that ultimately when this is built, the kind of aura and atmosphere of the house might be quite different. But like I said before, these are kind of aspirational, right? They're like ways of defining the mood of the project to an audience like you. In terms of how we do them, so we've worked with two very talented visualization artists, Peter Guthrie and Alexis Basso. And we worked with each of them at moments in their career where they were sort of happy to take on these unusual challenges that we would pose them. You know, for instance, you know, like very specific about how the fog should be in order to produce a feel of mournfulness. Like requests like, can you make pollution? There's a project in China we did where we asked them to model pollution, so the smog, to try to understand like the smog in China and have that characterize these houses. You know, for them was a kind of exciting challenge. In conversations with them, we're always referencing film, actually. So, like Inuratu, and you know, what was the Leo DiCaprio movie where he got inside the horse? What's the movie? Revenant. Yeah. So that was, you know, we were looking closely at that film and kind of walking Alexis through different scenes in that film as a way to try to get at the aura that we thought would be best for the Mask House. So it's really like the discussions are much more like, I think, discussions on a film set might be when we're talking about the visualizations for those projects.
Just building off of that note, and there seems to be this constant idea of like a view or like a ambiance or this idea. There's almost a picturesque idea, and back to what Professor Aranda said, historically, like you're at a place where there's a clean slate almost, where you have infinite opportunity. I keep, maybe it's a misunderstanding, but I see like constantly these like ideas or these like scenes or these things, and I don't see the process. I don't understand that part. It's just
Buy the book.
but I feel like I don't understand the.
No, I've heard that critique too. Where's the process? How are you arriving at these?
Maybe not the process, but the direction. I feel like I personally just feel like there's a strong sense of ideas or finished work.
But without the process, is what you're saying.
Possibly with the process,
Yeah.
but there's an idea of end goal. There's an idea of creation and the creator, and less the struggle and the learner.
Mm-hmm.
Unless there is something.
I think there's two.
So jumping off that question about the visualizations, I was kind of wondering, like, how do you guys see rendering as a design tool? How do you use it throughout your design? When does it come into play? Like, is it the final thing? Does it inform you guys through the way? And like, how does that play out?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sort of different for each project. We haven't really been consistent about when we make these. So for the Mask House, for instance, there were two rounds. One round that happened about maybe right after SD, where we didn't have all details worked out, but we still wanted to see what this started to look like spatially. And actually, in the case of the Mask House, sort of a unique situation in that the client who was a filmmaker and now is an entrepreneur, is sort of very much involved in VR. And so he was interested in trying to get this project into virtual space, and so there was a moment coincident with the first round of visualizations where we had the model in VR and were able to kind of experience it and walk through it. What was so funny about that was the VR experience was so lo-fi. It was like a kind of 1988 like Donkey Kong experience where like everything was kind of rendered in large green pixels or pink pixels, and just like, so that was designed to help us understand the space, right, and move through the space, whereas the first round of renderings were aimed to try to get at, I think, what Robert's talking about, these sort of like aspirational views that help unpack the relationships within the project. But the reason we started doing them in the first place was that, I didn't show any of the earlier projects, but a few houses that we had designed, the project stalled. And so we wanted a way of understanding, like, what is it that we had made? And so we used visualizations as a way to kind of make them, in a way, in a kind of fantastic or fictional sense. So we did that for an A-frame house and a sawtooth roof house that were projects that, you know, for a variety of reasons, the clients weren't able to push forward on. And then we realized that it was a really useful tool within the process as well. So since then, we've been making these kinds of visualizations as a way to have discussions with ourselves, right, and then as well as clients. But I think it's getting. I think in the future it will be much more, you know, readily available for your generation, certainly, to kind of move between the virtual, which can be quite real, and the kind of 2D space.
Why did you make the decision when you are looking into the place where the brother died, and how does the client feel about living there?
The mirror on the underbelly of the house?
On the window, I'm sorry. On the window looking into the space?
Yeah. The window next to the bed.
Right.
Yeah. So that came about because, I don't know if I explained this, but the house is really conceived of as 7 frames that kind of link up with the context in 7 very different ways. You know, from a kind of horizontal slice through all the trees to a vertical slice where you get a sense for how the tree, you know, the canopy. And so we wanted to kind of maximize the range of scales, right, from the biggest one, which is the primary space of the house, all the way to the scale of the body. It's a really charged opening, right? I mean, so it's sort of a personal decision on the part of the client to like be on board with that. But I think for him, it's an important registration of a line of sight that he wants to keep in mind and doesn't want to forget.
I think the number of questions that you got shows your renderings were successful and engaged everybody.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Appreciate it.